Welcome to Terran Apex Protocol, where the galaxy keeps underestimating humanity and keeps regretting it. If these stories are your kind of story, subscribe and stay with us. My name's Atlas. Today, a species that buys its worlds finished off a catalog arrives to repossess a dead rock the humans never finished paying for, and learns that some debts are measured in graves. Let's begin. The dead rock had no right to be casting a shadow on his instruments. Auditor Vesh Korin stood at the forward port of the gavel of settlement and watched the catalog designation Rock 7 turn beneath him, and the first thing he felt was professional offense. The planet was wrong. Not dead, which would have been clean, fileable, a single line in the ledger of defaulted assets. It was the worst thing. It was unfinished. Bands of gray-green crept across the equator where no green had any business being. A skin of cloud lay over the northern third, thin as breath-fogging glass, and at the edges of the cloud the surface glittered with water that should not have lasted a single season on a world this size and this far from a kindly sun. His throat ridge held perfectly still. He had trained 80 years to hold it still. Among the core, the mineral filaments that ran along the throat were a window the body could not close, and an auditor who let his filaments shiver in front of a client had already lost the negotiation. So Vesh held them flat and quiet, and he logged the offense the way his civilization had taught him to log everything. Asset Rock 7, Telkeen Compact Catalog. Sold under a long-billed clause to a minor species 200 standard years prior. On a payment schedule no sane buyer accepted, because no sane buyer bought a world that did not already work. The compact sold finished worlds. That was the entire point of the compact. You did not buy a rock and a promise. You bought a world the way you bought a meal, complete, warm, breathing, with the seas already poured and the weather already running, and the first forests already old. You moved your people in and you lived. That was civilization. That was what it meant to have risen far enough to deserve a home. What you did not do was buy Rock 7. The buyers were called humans. Vesh had read the species file on the transit in, and the file had not prepared him, because the file had been written by someone who assumed the humans understood what they had signed. Default was a formality. The long-billed clause carried a 200-year delivery window, and the window closed in 4 days, and Rock 7 was not finished. By the plain letter of the contract, it would never be finished, because no world was ever finished by hand. Worlds were finished in the compact's foundries and shipped whole. A buyer who tried to build one breath by breath had simply not understood the product, so Vesh had come to repossess it, log the default, seal the asset, schedule the resale. A dead account closed and reopened. He had done it 400 times. The shuttle ride down was the second offense. He had expected a husk, a scatter of pressure domes, a few starving colonists clinging to a machine that had failed them, the smell of a people who had lost and not yet admitted it. Instead, the shuttle came down through that thin skin of cloud, and there was weather. Actual weather, gray and unscheduled and damp, beating on the canopy in long crawling lines, the kind of unruly atmosphere that the compact's worlds were engineered specifically never to have. Below the cloud the land opened, and it was not a husk, it was a worksite. It went on past the horizon. There were channels cut into the rock, filled with dark water, lined with something low and green. There were towers, not the proud spires of a finished world, but squat and ugly and working, venting pale vapor into the sky in slow, patient breaths. There were fields under translucent sheeting and rail lines, and a vast gray machine the size of a town crawling on treads across the middle distance. Dragging behind it, a thing that Vesh's eyes refused to parse until the scale resolved, and he understood, with a small, cold drop in his certainty, that the machine was hauling a glacier. A piece of one. A mountain of dirty ice on rollers, inching across the land toward the equator at the speed of a thing that did not expect to arrive this year. His filaments wanted to move. He held them. A human was waiting at the pad. She wore a breathing mask and a work coat gone gray at the cuffs, and she did not bow, and she did not flinch, and she watched the gavel's auditor descend the ramp with the calm, flat attention of someone reading a delivery manifest. She was not afraid of him. That, more than the glacier, more than the weather, was the thing Vesh could not file. "I'm Mara Okonkwo," she said. "Site foreman. You'll be the auditor." "Vesh Koren, of the Telkeen Compact," he said, "and let the title do its work, because the title usually did. You are aware, foreman, that this asset is in default. The delivery window closes in 4 standard days. I am here to log the asset and seal it for resale." Mara nodded as if he had told her the weather, which, Vesh thought, he supposed in a sense he had. "I know what the clause says," she said. "We've known for 200 years. Walk with me, auditor. If you're going to write us up, you should at least see what you're writing up." He had logged 400 defaulted worlds. Not one of them had ever asked him to walk. She led him along a graded road of crushed black rock, and as they walked, she talked. And Vesh realized within the first minute that she was not pleading and she was not boasting. She was briefing him. She spoke the way his own logistics officers spoke, in tonnages and timelines and tolerances, and she never once raised her voice or reached for his pity, and this was somehow more unsettling than if she had wept. "We bought a 3% world," she said. "You know the rating. 3% survival probability for an unaltered settlement, projected over the 1st century. Your own surveyors wrote that. That's why it was cheap. That's why it was the only world your compact would sell to a species that had nothing. Nobody insures a 3% rock. Nobody finances one. So we didn't buy a finished world. We bought the rock and the time. We didn't buy a world," she said. "We bought a promise to make one." Vesh's translator rendered it cleanly, and he heard the words, and he filed them under buyer's delusion, because that was the only file he had for them. The compact did not sell promises, it sold worlds. A promise had no resale value. A promise could not be sealed and listed in the catalog. "How quaint," he said, and meant it as the small cruelty it was. "You bought a rock and called it hope. Foreman, in 4 days I seal it, and your people relocate, and the compact resells the asset to a buyer who will finish it the correct way, in a foundry, in a decade, complete. You have spent 200 years building a thing my civilization makes overnight." Mara stopped walking. She looked at him for a moment through the smoked plate of her mask, and what was in her face was not anger. It was something closer to patience, the kind of patience he would later understand was the only native resource this entire planet had ever been built from. "You make worlds overnight," she said. "Tell me, auditor, when was the last time the compact made a new one?" And Vesh Koren, who had an answer to every question, because answers were his trade, found that he did not have one, and he held his throat ridge very still, and he did not say anything at all. She took him to the ledger first. It was housed in the oldest of the pressure domes, a low building of poured stone, gone soft-cornered with age, and inside it was cool and dim and smelled of paper and machine oil, and along every wall stood the record of the build. Not screens, books. Bound physical ledgers, hundreds of them, spines cracked and labeled by hand and by year. And Mara walked the rows with one gloved hand trailing along them the way a person touches the names of family. 200 years of accounts, she said. Every gram of ice we hauled. Every culture of bacteria we seeded and everyone that died. Every soil batch, every rotation of workers, every birth and every death on this rock since the first lander. My great-grandmother started this book, her hands on the first page. I keep the last one. Vesh did not understand why they kept it on paper. He said so. Because a power failure can erase a database, Mara said. And we couldn't afford to forget anything. You forget one variable in a build this long, and the whole thing drifts off true 100 years later, and the people doing the work won't even know why it failed. So we wrote it all down. Slow and stupid and by hand. The way you write down something you mean to keep. She pulled a volume from near the start of the rows and opened it on a work table and turned it so the auditor could see. The pages were dense with a small, careful script in a language his translator could read and his mind could barely hold. Tonnages of cometary ice diverted and dropped into the northern basin over 40 years to make the first seas. Strains of engineered microbe, generation after generation, each one bred to eat the poison in the air and breathe out something a degree less lethal, each batch logged with its date and its result. And most of the early results were the same single word. Failed, failed, failed. Page after page of failure, recorded as carefully as any success, because to these people, a failure you wrote down was a failure your great-grandchildren would not have to repeat. You logged your losses, Vesh said slowly, with the same hand as your gains. A loss you don't record, Mara said, is a loss you pay for twice. She showed him the supply pages then, and these unsettled him more than the failures, because the failures were at least dramatic, and a core understood drama. The supply pages were just columns. Fuel cells rationed across decades so that the haulers never once stopped. Spare parts for machines whose manufacturers had gone extinct, machined by hand on the colony's own lathes from drawings copied and recopied for 2 centuries. A rotation schedule that assigned every able body on the planet a share of the dangerous work and the safe work both, so that no single family carried more than its measure of the dying, balanced, and rebalanced year on year in the same patient script. It was the most boring document Vesh had ever read, and it was the most frightening, because it was the proof that no one here had ever panicked. Panic was a thing that happened to people who expected to finish. These people had built a civilization on the understanding that they would not, and had made their peace with the arithmetic of it, and had simply kept the columns straight. Your ancestors planned for grandchildren they would never meet, Vesh said, down to the spare parts. Mara closed the book. We planned for strangers, she said. That's all grandchildren are when you start. Strangers you decide to love in advance. He turned the pages. The dates climbed, the seas filled. Somewhere around year 60, the single word failed began, here and there, to be replaced by another, and the other word was holding. And then, decades on, holding became frequent, and then holding became the rule, and Vesh Koren stood in a stone room on a defaulted asset and read 200 years of patience the way another auditor might have read a confession, and his certainty made a small sound he did not let reach his throat. He had logged 400 defaulted worlds. Not one of them had ever had a graveyard. He did not know yet that this one did. She took him to the forest in the morning, on the second day. It stood on the long slope below the northern basin, where the first hauled ice had become the first sea, and the first sea had wept moisture into the first stubborn soil. It was not a grand forest. The trees were thin and young and strange, grown from earth stock bent hard by an alien gravity and a meager sun, no two of them quite straight, and they came up only to twice Vesh's height, and they would not be tall for another 2 centuries. But they were trees. They stood in their thousands on a slope that the Compact's own survey had certified, in writing, as incapable of supporting rooted multicellular life for at least 1,000 years. The humans had done it in 90. A work crew was planting at the forest's edge, children mostly, small humans in small masks, pressing seedlings into the dark soil in patient rows, under the supervision of an old man who moved as if every joint hurt and did not let that slow the rows. Vesh watched a child no taller than his knee tamp the soil around a sapling with both small hands, and lean down and say something to it that the translator did not catch, and move on to the next. Why? Vesh asked. He had meant to ask it coldly. It did not come out cold. The trees will not be grown in their lifetime, nor in their children's. The shade of that forest, the air it will make, the world it will finish, none of these people will ever stand in it. Why do they plant? Mara watched the children for a while before she answered. And when she did, her voice was even, the steadiness she wore the way other people wore armor. My great-grandmother planted the first ones, she said. Hannah. She's in the ground up there at the top of the slope. She knew when she put them in that she'd never sit under them. She did it anyway. So did her whole generation. We plant because they planted. Because somebody 200 years from now is going to walk under those trees and breathe air that just works, that they never had to think about, and they'll have no idea what it cost. And that's the point, Auditor. That's the whole point. We're not building this for us. We never were. The old man at the edge of the rows straightened, saw the Auditor, and did not bow either. And Vesh understood that this was not insolence. These people simply did not have the reflex. They had spent 2 centuries answering to the work and not to anyone's title, and the habit had bred the deference out of them. The compact, Vesh said, and stopped. Because he had been about to say the compact builds worlds for the living, and he found the sentence would not finish in a way he could stand behind. We sell sky, Mara said, quietly, finishing a different sentence. You sell sky. We grow it. There's a difference, and your books don't have a column for it. On the way back down, she walked him past the ice. The town-sized machine had stopped to take on a fresh block, and Vesh stood at the edge of the basin and watched a crew the size of a single shift move a piece of frozen comet that weighed more than his ship. They did it without urgency. There were chalk marks on the ice where it had been scored for cutting, and a man on a high gantry calling out tolerances in the flat patient cadence of someone who had done this every day of his working life and expected his son to do it after him. A glacier a year, Mara said, watching with him. Sometimes 2, if the rail holds. We've moved 940 of them. Hannah moved the first 11 herself in a hauler with no heat. We named the hauler after the thing she said it needed to be. Patience. It's still running. We never let it stop because a thing you stop is a thing you have to learn to start again, and starting is the hard part. Vesh watched the ice go up the rail toward the equator at the speed of a debt being paid, and he understood that he was looking at logistics the way another species made war, total, generational, and absolutely without panic. That night, alone in the gavel of settlement, Auditor Vesh Korin ran the atmosphere readings, because the readings were data, and data did not plant trees for grandchildren, and data did not make him feel the thing he had spent 2 days refusing to feel. The reading came back, and he looked at it, and his throat ridge clicked, a hard, dry shiver of mineral on mineral, the first time it had betrayed him in 11 years. The air on Rock 7 was breathable. Not at the surface, not quite, not yet, not without the masks the humans still wore in the thin lowlands. But in the northern basin, on the forested slope, in the long valley where the first seas had pooled and the first forests had drunk, the partial pressures had crossed the line. Oxygen sufficient. Toxics below threshold. A core could have walked that valley unmasked and lived. A human, his file told him, was hardier than a core, and so the humans in that valley already did. The reading was wrong. It had to be wrong. He ran it again. He ran it a 3rd time, and a 4th, recalibrating the instrument each time the way an auditor recalibrates when the numbers insult the catalog. And each time the dead rock gave him the same answer. The air on the dead rock was breathable, and the trend line across the last 40 years of the human's own logged data said it was getting better, year on year, slow as a glacier, sure as a debt being paid. The Compact survey had rated this world at 3%. The survey had been correct. The world had been impossible. The humans had simply declined to accept the rating as a verdict and had treated it instead as a starting balance, and they had spent 200 years and 4 generations and an entire ledger of their own dead paying it down. Vesh sat with the reading for a long time. He thought about the catalog. He thought, against every instinct of his training, about the question Mara had asked him on the road, the one he still had no answer for. When was the last time the compact made a new one? He knew the answer now. He had always known it. It was simply not a thing an auditor was permitted to know out loud. The compact had not made a new world in 900 years. The foundries still ran. They still poured seas and seeded forests and shipped worlds whole. But they only ever finished worlds the compact had begun long ago, in a braver age, worlds banked and stockpiled by ancestors who had known how to start. The compact's catalog was an inheritance being spent. And the inherited worlds were failing now, quietly, faster than the foundries could replace them. Climates drifting, seas going sour, because a thing built to be perfect on the day of delivery has no idea how to repair itself the morning after. And somewhere in those 900 years, the compact had stopped knowing how to start one. A world, it turned out, was not a product you could finish and walk away from. It was a thing that had to keep being built, forever, by hands that did not expect to be thanked. The humans had never lost the knack of that, because the humans had never had the luxury of buying one finished, and so they had learned the slow way the thing the compact had paid a foundry to forget. Prelate Tovrek San repossessed dead worlds to keep the living from asking why no new ones were being born. And he was coming to Rock 7 himself. Vesh learned it the next morning, the third day, when the prelate's signal reached the gavel. The world's office was elevating the asset to direct seizure, and the prelate's cutter would make planetfall before the window closed. Vesh understood the calculation instantly. A 3% rock that defaulted was routine. A 3% rock that had reached breathable atmosphere by hand was a thing that could not be allowed to exist in the record. Because if it could be done by hand, then the compact's entire pretense, that worlds could only be bought, only be made in foundries, only be inherited from braver ancestors, came apart in a single broadcast. Tovrek was not coming to repossess a planet. He was coming to repossess a fact. Vesh went to find the foreman, and he told her, and he was no longer certain, as he told her, which side of the ledger he was standing on. Mara took the news the way she took everything, with a long, flat look and a recalculation behind the eyes. Then she said the thing that broke something in him, because she said it without any weight at all, the way you mention a cost so old it has stopped being a wound and become only a fact. You should know what it's built on, she said, before the prelate gets here. Before you decide what you're going to say. She took him back up the forested slope, to the top where the trees gave out and the old soil began, and there, under markers of plain-cut stone, was the graveyard. It was large. It was much larger than 3 generations of natural death should have made it. Vesh's eyes ran the rows and his auditor's instinct counted without being asked. And the count was wrong. The death rate compressed into too few decades. The markers from one stretch of years standing far too thick. The first generation that lived here, Mara said, couldn't wait for the air. We didn't have time. The bacteria were working, but the oxygen was coming up too slowly. And the seas needed seeding, and the forests needed planting now, in air that was still thin and still poisoned. And you can't do that work in a sealed suit. Not for 10,000 hours a year, for 40 years. So they took the masks off. On purpose, they breathed it. My great-grandmother's whole generation went out into air that was killing them and did the work that the next generation would need done. And they breathed the poison so the soil could learn to breathe, and they died of it. Lung rot. Most of them before they were 50. Hannah lasted to 51. She's the third stone in the second row. Vesh looked at the third stone in the second row. It said Hannah Okonkwo, and two dates too close together, and below the dates a single line in the human script, which his translator gave him after a moment, and which read, "She signed for 200 years. They knew," Mara said. Every one of them knew what the heir would do. They wrote it in the ledger. There's a page, year 31, it's just names and lung volumes. My great-grandmother's handwriting, getting worse down the column as the years go and her own lungs go with it. They logged their own dying like they logged everything else. Because a cost you don't record is a cost your grandchildren pay twice. This planet's air, the air in that valley that your instrument says a core could breathe, that air is them, auditor. They're in the soil. They are the soil. The world is built on them, and I mean that the plain way, not the poetic way. We are standing on the people who made the air. Vesh Korin stood in the human graveyard at the top of the slope, and his throat ridge shivered and clicked and would not be stilled, and he did not try to still it anymore. Repossession was legal. The clause was plain. The window closed tomorrow. The asset was unfinished by the letter. The prelate had every right under compact law to seal it and clear these people off and resell the rock to a buyer who would never know what was under the forest. Repossession was legal. That was the part that would not let him rest. The prelate Tovrek San came down on the fourth day in a black cutter that did not bother to land at the worksite pad, but burned a fresh scar into the plain near the basin and settled into it as if to remind the rock who owned it. He came out flanked by 2 enforcement corps, and his own throat ridge was capped in worked silver, an affectation of high office that meant his stress could never be read at all. And Vesh understood the silver now in a way he never had before. The prelate had armored the one part of himself that might tell the truth. "Foreman Okonkwo," the prelate said, and his voice through the translator was smooth and warm and final. "The long-billed clause has expired. Asset Rock 7 is in default. I am here to seal it. Your people will be relocated to a compact catalog world at standard resettlement rate, a finished world. Foreman, a kindness your contract does not require me to offer. The seal goes live at the close of the window. You have 1 hour. He had brought a broadcast drone. Of course he had. The seizure of a defaulted asset was usually done in private, but the public destruction of a dangerous fact wanted witnesses, wanted the whole compact to see a human world fail and be taken, wanted the lesson taught that worlds come from foundries and from no one's stubborn hands. The drone's lens opened like a slow eye, and somewhere across the Telkeen compact, billions began to watch. Mara Okonkwo did not argue with the law. Vesh saw her decide not to, in the first second, saw her set down the fight she could not win and pick up the only thing she had ever really had. She walked to the prelate's broadcast drone, into the eye of it, where billions could see her, and she did not raise her voice. "My great-grandmother signed for 200 years, she said. We are on year 196. We are not late. The clause says complete by the window, the prelate said. Not nearly. Not bravely. Complete. Your world is not complete." "No," Mara said. "It isn't. It won't be complete for another 200 years. That's not a default, prelate. That's the design. You sell worlds that are finished the day they're delivered and start dying the day after, because a finished thing has nowhere to go but down. We didn't buy a finished world. We bought a dead rock, and we have spent 200 years teaching it to breathe. And it is breathing now, and it will keep breathing, and keep growing, and keep finishing itself for 1,000 years after every one of us is in that soil. Because we didn't build a product. We built something alive. You cannot repossess a thing that is still being born." And then she did the only thing left to do. She reached up in the eye of the broadcast on the breathable slope below the basin, and she took off her mask. Vesh's filaments went rigid. The prelate's enforcers tensed. Across the compact, billions watched a human stand bare-faced on a world rated 3%, a world the catalog swore could not hold air and breathe it. She drew a long, slow breath of the air her great-grandmother had died to make, and she held it, and she let it out, and she was the first of her whole line to ever do it standing on this slope without a wound for it. And she had timed it. Vesh realized she had walked them all the long way up here to this exact slope on this exact day, because it was the one patch of her world that would let her do this and live, and she had done it not for herself, but for the eye, for the billions, so that they would see the thing the prelate had come to bury. "It's breathing," she said, on the open air, with no mask between her and the world. 200 years, you sell sky, we grew it, and we grew it for people who aren't born yet, so go ahead, prelate, seal it. Tell the whole compact you took a world away from the dead, who made it because they were 4 days slow, paying a debt to a foundry that hasn't made a world of its own in 900 years. The graveyard was on the broadcast now, too. The drone, hunting for the dramatic image, had found the rows of plain stone at the top of the slope, the names, the dates too close together. Hannah Okonkwo's line glowing in the human script. She signed for 200 years. Billions of Kor and Telkeen and a dozen other species saw the graves and saw the breathing woman, and the silence that came over the broadcast was the silence of a civilization recognizing, all at once, a thing it had taught itself to forget. Prelate Tovrek San stood in that silence with the seal in his hand, and the worked silver at his collar told no one anything. And that, Vesh thought, was the loneliest sight on the whole grieving world. The prelate was afraid. He had always been afraid. He repossessed dead worlds, because every dead world he sealed was a world he did not have to admit, the compact could no longer replace. And now a small species with a paper ledger had grown a living one by hand in front of all his witnesses, and there was no foundry in the compact that could answer it. "Seal it," the prelate said, and his smooth voice cracked once on the second word, and the seal began to glow. Auditor Vesh Koren stepped into the eye of the drone. He had spent 80 years learning to hold his throat still, and he let it move now, let the filaments shiver and click for billions to see, because the time for composure was a thing he had buried somewhere on the slope between Hannah's stone and the breathing woman. He spoke into the broadcast as a sworn auditor of the Telkeen Compact, and his testimony went into the permanent record the instant he gave it, and could not be unsaid. "I have audited the asset," he said. "The atmosphere of Rock 7 is breathable and improving on a stable 40-year trend, verified 4 times against my own instruments. The world is not in decline. It is the only world in the Compact's registry that is getting better instead of worse. By the Compact's own surveying standard, that makes it not a defaulted asset, but the single most valuable world we hold, and I will not seal it, and I will not let it be resold, and I am entering into the record the reason the world's office does not want it spoken. The Compact has not begun a new world in 900 years. We sell our ancestors' work and call it ours. These people are the only ones left in the galaxy who still know how to start." He turned to Mara, bare-faced and steady in the open air, and he said the thing that had been forming in him since the road on the first day. "You are the only people left who build for someone you will never meet, Foreman." The seal went dark in the prelate's hand. Across the compact, billions had heard a sworn auditor confess the thing the catalog existed to hide, and a confession in the permanent record could not be sealed and could not be resold, and Tovrek San knew it. He stood a moment longer, an old afraid Kor in a silver collar, and then he did the only mathematics left to him, the auditor's mathematics, and he saw that the asset he could most cheaply save was himself. "The world's office," he said, "will review the long-billed clause." He did not look at the graves when he said it. He could not. "The window is extended pending review." It was not an apology. It was a man saving himself. But it was also a world, kept breathing, and Mara Okonkwo had spent her whole life learning that you take the win the universe actually hands you and you log it, and you keep building. So she nodded once, the same nod she had given the auditor on the pad, and she put her mask back on, because there was still work to do in the thin lowlands, and the air up here belonged to the people who weren't born yet. The review took 2 years. The compact does everything slowly, except the things it should do slowly, and it had no practice at humility. And learning takes a civilization longer than it takes a world. But the broadcast had been seen, and the graves had been seen, and a thing seen by billions cannot be wholly undecided. In the end, the Telkeen Compact rewrote the charter of its world's office, and the new charter contained a clause that had never existed in 900 years. A clause that defined a world not as a finished product delivered whole, but as a living account that a people keeps, forever, by hand. They called it the Long-Billed Standard. They named it after no one. The humans never asked them to. Vesh Koren testified at the charter hearings, and the last thing he said into the record was the thing the whole compact most needed to hear and least wanted to. A civilization that only buys finished worlds, he told them, has forgotten how to deserve one. He did not raise his voice. He had spent his whole career making certainty sound like authority, and he had finally found a sentence that did not need either. The chamber was quiet for a long time after. Then he resigned his auditor's commission, and he did a thing no core of his rank had done in living memory. He asked the humans for work. They did not make a ceremony of it. Mara read his name into the labor rotation the way she read everyone's, between a soil batch and a rail repair, and put him on the ice cruise. So Vesh Koren spent the back half of his life hauling glaciers one mountain at a time toward an equator he would not live to see green, in a hauler that had been old when his grandfather was born, and he kept the ledger of his shifts in his own careful hand, and he found, to his astonishment, that his throat ridge stayed still on its own out there, with no effort at all, for the first time in his life. He had spent 80 years guarding a window into himself. It turned out all it had ever wanted was honest work and somewhere worth pointing toward. Mara Okonkwo was offered a seat on the New World's office, a title, a finished apartment on a finished world, with a sky that already worked. She declined it the way her great-grandmother would have, which is to say in one sentence, while looking at a manifest. "I have a forest to grow," she said, "and a ledger to keep, and I'm not done." She was not done. The work would not be done for 200 more years, and then it would not be done after that, because that was the nature of a world that was alive instead of bought. But on the morning the charter passed, Mara Okonkwo climbed the forested slope to the top, past the thin young trees that would not be tall for 2 centuries, to the rows of plain stone and the third marker in the second row. And there, on the one patch of her whole world that the dead had made breathable, she stood under an open and unscheduled sky, gray and damp and entirely her own, and she reached up and took off her mask and she breathed. It was the first time in her life she had done it on this slope, and known she would walk back down. It was the first time anyone named Okonkwo had stood at Hannah's grave and breathed the air without a wound for it. She did not say anything. There was nothing in the ledger that needed saying. She just breathed, slow and deep, the air her great-grandmother had bought with 200 years and never once gotten to taste. And then she turned and went back down the slope to the lowlands, where the air was still thin, and where there was, as there had always been, more work to do.